I've listened to people lie in my courtroom so convincingly that even the truth started to sound doubtful. But Karen Mitchell was different. She didn't just lie, she performed, and she believed she was untouchable. The case started as a simple public disturbance on paper. But the moment Karen stepped into my courtroom, I could feel something off, something rehearsed in the way she carried herself, calm, controlled, almost entertained. Behind her stood her husband, David Mitchell, not beside her, behind her. That detail told me more than any file ever could. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves began laying out the incident. Outside a Chicago restaurant, a confrontation with police, raised voices, refusal to de-escalate, public escalation that drew attention from bystanders. Karen didn't react, not a blink, not a shift. But David did. Every time her name was spoken, his attention snapped toward her first, like he was checking if he was still safe to think independently. That was my first concern. Defense attorney Rachel Morgan tried to soften the image. Emotional stress, misinterpretation, a situation blown out of proportion. Still, Karen said nothing. Then came the moment everything tilted. David Mitchell was called to testify. He stepped forward like a man walking into a room he had already lost control of. "Tell the court what happened," the prosecutor said. A pause followed, too long, and then he spoke. "She wasn't aggressive. People just took it the wrong way." I watched Karen carefully. No relief, no emotion, only dissatisfaction, as if his answer didn't meet expectations. That's when the dynamic became clear. This wasn't a man defending his wife. It was a man trying not to trigger her. And in my courtroom, that difference is never small. The prosecutor pressed further. "Did she raise her voice at the officers?" Another silence. Then David said something that froze the entire room. "Yes, but they deserved it." The air in the courtroom tightened instantly, but I wasn't watching the statement. I was watching Karen. Her faint smile, the same one she carried since entering, slowly disappeared. For the first time, something behind her eyes shifted, not anger, not fear, control slipping. And I knew, sitting there in silence, that this case was going to expose something far deeper than a public disturbance, because David Mitchell had just begun speaking. And what he was about to reveal would change everything. David Mitchell didn't sit back down immediately after his last answer. That alone told me this was no longer a controlled testimony. It was unraveling. The prosecutor didn't rush him. Michael Reeves understood something most attorneys eventually learn in my courtroom. When a witness starts losing internal balance, you don't interrupt them. You let the pressure do the work. Mr. Mitchell, Reeves continued quietly. "When you say they deserved it, what exactly do you mean?" David exhaled through his nose, a small strained breath, then he spoke again. "I mean, the officers were being disrespectful first. They were escalating her." I noticed something important in his phrasing. Not I saw, not I believe, but she was being escalated, as if the responsibility belonged to everyone except the person he was trying to protect. Karen still didn't react. But her fingers moved slightly on the table, a subtle tap, ridden that gesture before. It's not anxiety, it's restraint. The prosecutor took a step closer. "Mr. Mitchell, were you present for the entire interaction?" "Yes." "And did your wife comply with lawful instructions from law enforcement?" A pause, longer this time. David's jaw tightened. That's when I saw it, the internal conflict, because whatever answer he gave next would either protect her or expose her. She was asking questions," he said finally. Reeves didn't blink. "Mr. Mitchell, that's not what I asked." Silence hit the room again, and this silence was different. This wasn't uncertainty. This was pressure building toward collapse. David's shoulders dropped slightly, then he said it. "No. She didn't comply immediately. A shift moved through the jury box, not dramatic, subtle, but noticeable. And Karen, finally, leaned forward just slightly for the first time in the entire trial. I realized she was listening now, not observing, listening." Reeves continued. "When officers attempted to de-escalate, what did your wife do?" David hesitated again, and this time he looked at Karen before answering. That single glance told me everything. He wasn't recalling events, he was negotiating memory. "She raised her voice," he admitted, "and she made comments." "What kind of comments?" David's mouth opened, then closed. That hesitation was louder than any answer he could have given. And then, "I don't think that matters," he finally said. That was the wrong answer. Not legally, psychologically. Because in my courtroom, when a witness starts deciding what matters, it usually means they're trying to protect something they can no longer control. The prosecutor stepped back slightly. Now he had him. "Mr. Mitchell," Reeves said, "is it your testimony that the officers were responsible for your wife's reaction?" David nodded too quickly. "Yes." But even he knew it didn't sound strong anymore. It sounded rehearsed. Karen's expression changed again. That faint disappointment returned. And I saw it clearly now. This wasn't love. It was management. The courtroom felt heavier with every passing second. And then Reeves, asked the question that broke the pattern entirely. Mr. Mitchell, has your wife ever reacted like this before? David froze, not for a second, for several. And in that silence, I saw him make a decision he had been avoiding since the moment he stepped into my courtroom. He looked at Karen again longer this time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Yes, one word, but it didn't end there, because what he said next changed the entire direction of this case. And I still remember the exact moment the courtroom realized we were no longer dealing with a single incident. We were dealing with a pattern Karen did not want exposed, and a husband who had just crossed a line he could never step back over. David Mitchell didn't speak again immediately. That single yes had already done more damage than any long explanation ever could. I watched him closely as he stood there, shoulders tense, hands slight trembling now, as if his own body had finally stopped cooperating with him. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves didn't rush. He understood what had just happened. A door had opened, and now it was too late to close it. Mr. Mitchell, Reeves said calmly, "You answered yes. I need you to clarify that for the court." David swallowed hard. The first time he didn't look at Karen immediately. He looked at the floor, and that told me everything about where this testimony was heading. "Yes," he repeated, quieter this time. "She's reacted like this before. A shift moved through the courtroom. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy. Like everyone had just started hearing something they weren't supposed to hear. Karen finally spoke. Her voice was calm, too calm. David, just his name, but it carried something sharp underneath it, a warning. I've seen enough relationships inside courtrooms to know when a single name becomes a leash. David flinched slightly, but he didn't stop. That was the moment I realized something had changed in him. Fear was losing its grip. Reeves stepped forward again. How many times before this incident? Silence. David hesitated for a long time, long enough that the jury started shifting in their seats. Then he said it. More than once. Karen leaned back slowly. Her expression didn't break, but something in her eyes hardened. Not surprise, not anger control recalculating. Reeves didn't stop. Were police ever involved in those previous incidents? David nodded. Yes. The courtroom tightened again. Now it was no longer about a single day outside a restaurant. It was becoming something else entirely, a pattern of escalation, a history no one had been prepared for. Defense attorney Rachel Morgan finally stood. Objection, relevance to this specific charge, but I raised my hand slightly, not to shut her down, to slow everything down because I wanted to hear where this was going, and more importantly, I wanted to see where David was going when no one was protecting him anymore. Reeves turned back to the witness. Mr. Mitchell, in those previous incidents, did your wife ever become physically aggressive? A pause, long heavy, David's jaw tightened, and then he said it. Yes, that word landed differently because this time Karen didn't move, not a single expression shift. It was more disturbing than any reaction she could have shown. Reeves continued. Toward you? Another pause. David nodded. Yes, the jury box shifted again, now fully alert, fully engaged. I remember thinking in that moment, this is no longer about public disturbance. This is about something the court file never captured. Karen's voice finally cut through again, soft, controlled, but dangerous. David, stop talking. Not loud, not emotional, just final. But something unexpected happened. He didn't stop. For the first time, he kept going. And that's when everything changed, because David Mitchell, standing in my courtroom, looked directly at the prosecutor and said the words that no one in that room was prepared for. He makes people afraid to disagree with her. The silence that followed was absolute, even I felt it. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just testimony anymore. This was an exposure, a truth breaking through restraint. And Karen Mitchell was no longer smiling at all. David's words hung in the courtroom like something that didn't belong in a legal proceeding. She makes people afraid to disagree with her. No one moved immediately after that. Not the jury, not the attorneys, not even Karen Mitchell. And that silence was the first real crack in the atmosphere of control she had maintained since the moment she entered my courtroom. I remember watching her carefully because, in my experience, when people are truly innocent of what's being suggested, they react to accusation, but when they recognize it as truth being spoken out loud, they go still. And Karen went still. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves didn't press immediately. He let the weight settle. Then he asked quietly, "Afraid? In what way, Mr. Mitchell?" David exhaled sharply. It sounded like someone finally letting go of something they had been holding for too long. "In every way," he said, "emotionally, mentally, even socially." A murmur passed through the jury box, small, controlled, but present. Karen finally turned her head slightly toward him. Not fully, just enough. That subtle movement told me something important. She was no longer managing the situation. She was assessing damage. Reeves stepped closer. Explain to the court what you mean by socially. David hesitated again, but this time there was less fear in the hesitation, more exhaustion. She isolates people, he said. If she feels challenged, she shuts it down. Friends stop calling. Conversations stop happening. It just becomes easier to agree with her than to argue. I saw one of the jurors glance at another juror. That silent exchange told me the narrative was starting to take shape in their minds. Defense attorney Rachel Morgan stood quickly. Objection. This is turning into character defamation rather than facts of the incident. I considered it briefly. Then I spoke. Overruled. The court will determine relevance. And I meant it because by then it was already clear this testimony wasn't about personality. It was about behavior patterns that explained the incident in question. David, people don't see it at first, he said. She's very composed in public. But at home, it's different. Karen's fingers tapped once on the table again, harder this time. Controlled, Reeves didn't miss it. Different how? David hesitated, and for the first time, he looked directly at her while answering. That alone shifted the entire courtroom dynamic. Arguments don't stay arguments, he said quietly. They become consequences. Silence becomes punishment. The air tightened again. I noticed even the court reporter paused slightly before continuing typing. Reeves lowered his voice. Mr. Mitchell, are you saying your wife uses intimidation? David didn't answer immediately. Then, yes. That word landed heavier than all the previous ones combined because it was no longer vague, no longer interpretive. It was direct. Karen finally spoke again, but her voice was different now. Not controlled, not calm, strained under restraint. David, you're embarrassing yourself. That sentence was meant to shut him down. I recognized it instantly. Not anger, but something unexpected happened next. David didn't recoil. He actually straightened slightly and looked at her with something I hadn't seen from him before. Clarity. Reeves noticed it too. Mr. Mitchell, he said carefully, are you afraid of your wife right now? The courtroom froze again. This was the point of no return. David didn't answer immediately. Karen didn't move. And I remember thinking, whichever way he answered, something irreversible was about to happen in that courtroom. He finally spoke, quickly, but firmly, yes. That single word didn't just answer the question. It changed the case entirely. And in that moment, I understood why he had been standing behind her since the beginning. Because this was never just a witness. This was someone who had been waiting a long time to finally be heard, and what he revealed next would force everyone in that courtroom to see Karen Mitchell in a way none of them expected. David's yes didn't echo in the courtroom. Didn't need to. It settled heavy. Final. Uncomfortable in a way that made people instinctively shift in their seats as if physical movement could reduce what they had just heard. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Even Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves paused. Not out of uncertainty, but because he understood something critical had just happened. The testimony had stopped being about an incident. It had become about a relationship. And relationships like that don't stay contained inside a courtroom. Karen Mitchell finally broke her silence, but when she spoke this time, her voice wasn't sharp. It was controlled, dangerously controlled. David, she said slowly, you need to think carefully about what you're doing right now. That sentence changed the temperature of the room because it wasn't a denial, it wasn't emotion, it was a reminder, a signal, a line drawn without raising her voice. I remember watching David very closely at that moment. In my experience, most people recoil when that kind of pressure is applied in open court, but David didn't. Instead, something in him settled. Like a man who had already accepted the consequences before speaking, Reeves stepped in again, sensing the opening. Mr. Mitchell, he said, has your wife ever directly threatened you? Karen's fingers stopped moving on the table completely. That small detail didn't escape me. David hesitated long enough that the jury started leaning forward slightly. And then he answered, yes. A ripple moved through the courtroom, not loud but undeniable. Reeves didn't let it breathe. In what context? David swallowed, and for the first time, his voice carried something that wasn't hesitation or fear. It carried memory. Every time I disagreed with her, he said, it wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a look. A shift in tone, like I already knew what would happen if I pushed too far. I saw one of the jurors look down at their notes, then stop writing altogether because this was no longer abstract. It was becoming visual. Reeves continued carefully. Can you give the court an example? David nodded slowly. Yes. Karen's head tilted slightly toward him, not fully, just enough, watching, always watching, and David said it. There was an incident last year at our home. We argued about something small. I don't even remember what started it. but it escalated fast. He paused, then continued. And when I tried to leave the room, she blocked the doorway. The courtroom changed again. That detail landed differently because it wasn't emotional interpretation. It was physical action, a witnessable event. Defense attorney Rachel Morgan immediately stood. Objection, this is outside the scope of the current charge. I raised my hand again, but this time more firmly. Overruled. The witness may continue. And I watched Karen very carefully. For the first time, her composure had a fracture, not visible to everyone, but visible to me. Reeves stepped forward. What happened next? David exhaled slowly. I told her I needed space, he said. And she told me I wasn't leaving the conversation until she was finished. A pause, then the final piece. I stayed. Silence. No one reacted immediately. Because everyone in the room understood what that meant without it needing explanation, Reeves lowered his voice. Mr. Mitchell, why did you stay? David looked down, and when he answered, it wasn't rehearsed anymore. It wasn't defensive. It was honest in a way that made the courtroom feel smaller, because it was easier, he said, than what would happen if I didn't. That was the moment I saw it, not just in his testimony, but in Karen's expression, a subtle tightening, not panic, recognition. Because she understood something important had just shifted permanently, Reeves paused, then asked the question that brought everything to its edge. Mr. Mitchell, do you believe your wife is dangerous? The courtroom held its breath. David didn't look at Karen this time. He looked straight ahead and said, yes. That word did not echo. It detonated, and for the first time since the trial began. Karen Mitchell didn't look in control of anything at all. She slowly turned toward him, and what she said next would change the entire direction of this courtroom forever. Karen Mitchell didn't raise her voice, and that was exactly what made her next words so disturbing. She turned slowly toward David, as if the entire courtroom had simply faded into background noise, and then she said it. David, you're not supposed to say that in public. A few jurors exchanged glances because on the surface it sounded like a personal disagreement, but in my courtroom I heard something else entirely, a correction, not a denial, a correction of behavior. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves stepped forward immediately. Mrs. Mitchell, you are still a defendant in this proceeding. I would advise you not to speak without counsel. Karen didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on David. That level of focus is rarely emotional. It is strategic. David looked back at her now. And for the first time since the trial began, there was no hesitation in his expression, only exhaustion. Karen leaned slightly forward and spoke again, quieter this time. You're making this bigger than it is. That sentence landed differently than anything before it, because it wasn't an argument, it was minimization. And minimization in cases like this is often more revealing than denial. Reeves didn't stop. Mr. Mitchell, he said, has your wife ever attempted to prevent you from speaking about these incidents before today? David hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Karen's jaw tightened slightly, barely visible. But I noticed. Reeves continued. In what way? David exhaled slowly. She would tell me it's unnecessary, he said, that nobody would believe me anyway, that it would ruin things for both of us. A shift moved through the courtroom again. Not shocked this time. Something more uncomfortable. Recognition. Because everyone understands a statement like that. Karen finally turned her gaze away from David and looked at me directly. That was the first time she acknowledged the authority of the court since this began. And she said something that surprised even me. This is getting out of hand, Your Honor. Calm voice, carefully chosen words, but underneath it was pressure, not emotional procedural. She was trying to redirect the courtroom itself. I responded evenly. The witness is under examination. He will finish his testimony. Karen held my gaze for a moment longer, then slowly sat back, but she didn't relax. She never relaxed. Reeves turned back to David. Mr. Mitchell, earlier you stated you are afraid of your wife. You explained that fear to the court. David paused long, then finally said, it's not fear like being scared of violence all the time. A breath. It's fear of consequences, of reactions, of what happens after. Reeves nodded slightly. Can you be more specific? And that's when David said the line, I will never forget. Every time I disagreed with her, I stopped recognizing myself afterward. Silence again. Even I felt that one differently, because it wasn't dramatic, it was psychological. Reeves didn't rush. Did you ever shook his head? No. Why not? And this time, David finally looked directly at Karen again and answered, because she convinced me I didn't need it. That sentence changed the atmosphere in a way I cannot fully describe, not legally. Emotionally, Karen's expression finally cracked, not into anger, not into panic, but into something far more controlled calculation, because at that moment she understood the narrative had fully left her control. Reeves took a step back and asked the final question of this phase. Mr. Mitchell, If you had to summarize your marriage in one sentence for this court, what would you say? Dave didn't hesitate this time, and when he answered, the entire courtroom went completely still. It feels like I'm always trying not to set off a version of her I never agreed to live with. No one moved, no one spoke, and I remember thinking, sitting on that bench, this is no longer a trial about conduct. This is a trial about identity. And what happens when someone slowly loses theirs inside a relationship no one else could see clearly until now? Karen slowly leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since she entered my courtroom, she didn't look like she was winning. She looked like she was deciding what to do next, and whatever she chose would determine how this case ended. Karen Mitchell didn't speak immediately after David's last statement. That silence was different from all the others earlier. Silence meant tension. Now it meant calculation. I could see it in the way she sat back, slowly, her hands resting neatly on the table, her posture returning to that composed version of herself she had worn since the beginning of the trial. But something had changed. The balance had shifted permanently. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves stood quietly for a moment, as if deciding whether to push further or let the weight of everything already said settle into the record. Then he moved. Mr. Mitchell, he said, just one final clarification. David nodded slowly. Reeves continued. Everything you have described today, has any of it been exaggerated or influenced by anyone else? That was a precise question, a closing question. David didn't look at Karen this time. He looked straight ahead and said, no. That single word removed the last layer of ambiguity from his testimony. Reeves paused, then turned slightly toward the defense table, and that's when Karen finally spoke again, not to David, not to Reeves, to me. Your Honor, she said calmly, this entire testimony is emotional, not factual. My husband is clearly under stress and misinterpreting private marital disagreements. I've heard variations of that argument many times in my career, but this time something felt different because it didn't sound like denial. It sounded like containment. Defense attorney Rachel Morgan quickly followed. There is no corroborating evidence of threats or intimidation. We are asking the court to disregard speculative character claims, but the damage had already been done because this case was no longer built on speculation. It was built on a witness who had lived inside the dynamic. I leaned forward slightly and spoke. The court has heard direct testimony from the witness. It will be considered accordingly. Karen's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, then returned to neutral. But I noticed something important. She was no longer looking at David with emotion. She was evaluating him like an outcome she hadn't predicted. Reeves took one final step. Mr. Mitchell, do you feel safe returning home with your wife today? The courtroom went still again. This question always carries weight, but this time it felt heavier than usual. David hesitated longer than before, and then he answered, no. That was the final fracture. Because it wasn't about the past anymore, it was about the present and future risk. A murmur passed through the jury box, small, controlled, but irreversible in meaning. Karen exhaled slowly. Then she did something I didn't expect. She smiled again. Not the earlier confident smile, something smaller, more contained, and she said quietly, this is going to ruin both of us. There was no emotion in it, just certainty. Reeves turned toward her. Mrs. Mitchell, are you threatening the witness? Karen tilted her head slightly. No, she said. I'm stating reality. That distinction mattered more than she realized, because in my courtroom, intent is not always defined by tone. Sometimes it is defined by impact, and the impact here was already undeniable. I looked at David one last time. He wasn't shaking anymore. He wasn't hesitating. He looked finished, not defeated, resolved, and that's when I made my decision. I closed the witness testimony phase and addressed the court directly. This testimony will be entered into record in full, I said. The court will now proceed to evaluate all statements alongside evidence and prior reports. Karen remained perfectly still, but I could feel it the moment she understood the direction this was going. This was no longer about defending her version of events. It was about whether that version could survive contact with everything that had just been spoken in open court. And as the session was adjourned for deliberation preparation, Dave Mitchell stood slowly, and for the first time since this trial began, he didn't look at Karen for permission. He simply walked out. And I remember thinking that moment didn't just end a testimony, it ended control. Because whatever happened between them next was no longer protected by silence, and justice, in its slowest and most uncomfortable form, had already begun.